The air did not just turn warm, it turned thick, black, and impossible to breathe. George surged upright, his eyes stinging, the roar of the inferno already vibrating through the floorboards. He shoved the bedroom door open. The hallway, a tunnel of orange light. He grabbed Jenny, then hauled the 4 children out into the biting cold of the West Virginia night. They stood on the frozen grass, shivering, gasping for oxygen that wasn't choked with ash. Then, the count stopped. George spun around, the heat radiating off the structure like a physical blow, his voice swallowed by the crackle of timber. He lunged toward the front door, but the wall of heat slammed into him, forcing him back onto the ice. He grabbed at the air, his knuckles white, watching the second floor become a tomb. The house was a hollowed-out lantern of flame, and within the light, everything he loved was vanishing. He stood motionless, his lungs burning, waiting for a rescue that would not come for 7 agonizing hours. The fire did not start in the wiring. It started months earlier, at the edge of the property line. George had built his life in Fayetteville from nothing, turning his trucking business into the foundation of a future. He spoke his mind, his voice loud against the tyranny of Mussolini, and in that town, his words found the wrong ears. One afternoon, a stranger stopped at the gate. He did not ask for work. He did not ask for water. He simply stood there, his hand resting on the wood, and gestured toward the windows of the house. "Your children will be destroyed," the man said, his voice flat, devoid of any malice, yet heavy with certainty. George ignored him, turning back to his work, dismissing the man as a bitter drifter. He returned to his truck, the engine turning over with a steady, reassuring hum. He walked back to the house, his mind filled with the logistics of the next delivery. He never looked back. He never told Jenny. He kept the silence, believing he had the power to protect his own by simply refusing to acknowledge the threat. By the time the flames hit the floorboards on Christmas Eve, he realized the man had not been predicting the future. He had been planning it. The fire fed on the dry timber with a ravenous, rhythmic roar. Flames licked the underside of the roof, turning the second floor into a furnace that no human could penetrate. George sprinted toward the side of the house, his breath hitching in the frigid Abdo.X stare. He stared up at the windows where his children slept, the glass already spiderwebbing from the internal pressure. He screamed their names, his voice raw, fingers scraping against the siding, but the heat acted like a physical blow, shoving him backward into the snow. He scrambled to his feet, eyes fixed on the upper level, watching as the orange light bled through the floorboards. The heat was a living force, pushing him back, guarding the tomb it had created. He stood there, legs trembling, chest heaving, his hands balled into fists against his sides. Every second that passed felt like a lifetime of failure. He called out again, but the only reply was the collapse of a support beam, sending a shower of sparks into the dark sky. The fire had claimed the house, and with every passing heartbeat, the silence from the upper floor grew more absolute, leaving him standing in the cold, utterly, terrifyingly alone. George turned to the side of the house, desperate for any leverage. He lunged for the ladder that always hung against the exterior wall, his hands grasping at empty air. It was gone. He pivoted toward the garage, stumbling through the snow to his 2 coal trucks. He turned the key in the first ignition. Silence. He tried the second, his knuckles white against the metal. The engine did not even sputter. He tore open the hood, his fingers tracing the internal lines, and felt the jagged, clean edge of severed wires. The cold realization hit him harder than the fire. This was not a random spark. He ran to the side of the house, clawing at the phone line, only to find the wire hanging limp, sliced through with precision. Every path to his children had been methodically dismantled. He stood in the dark, the fire casting long, dancing shadows across his face, and looked at his own hands. He had been a man of industry, a man of plans, but he had been outmaneuvered. The house was not just burning, it was being held hostage by an invisible hand. The terror whole shifted from the loss of his home to the hunt for an architect of this destruction. The dawn brought no warmth, only a biting, gray stillness. The fire had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a skeletal framework of charred timber and deep, suffocating ash. George and Jenny moved into the ruins, their boots crunching on the cool debris. They worked in silence, hands trembling as they raked through the heavy layers of soot. They searched for the smallest sign: a buckle, a fragment of bone, a tooth, anything that would anchor their grief in reality. George pushed aside a blackened beam with his boot, his eyes scanning the ground with a frantic, desperate intensity. There was nothing. The earth beneath the house was clean, stripped of the physical toll an inferno should have taken. He sank to his knees, clawing at the dust, but his fingers met only cold, gray grit. Jenny stood nearby, watching the wind stir the fine ash, her face blank with a shock that transcended tears. The math of the fire refused to resolve. Intense heat should have left behind the dense, calcified remnants of 5 children, yet the site was barren. They stared into the pile, the lack of evidence more terrifying than the fire itself. The house had not just burned, it had erased everything it held. The fire chief stood amidst the cooling ruins, his voice flat as he delivered the verdict. He claimed the flames had reached temperatures high enough to incinerate the children entirely, leaving no trace. George stared at the man, his mind racing against the claim. It was an impossibility. Even the most devastating residential fire could not vaporize bone and teeth into thin air. Forensic experts were soon consulted, and their findings were absolute. A house fire, regardless of duration, would leave behind calcified human remains. The chief's theory was not just flawed, it was a physical impossibility. The reality of the situation hit the community with the force of a landslide. If the children had not burned, then where were they? George began to pace the perimeter of the foundation, his eyes scanning for any disturbance in the soil that might suggest an exit path. The silence of the ruins was now replaced by a frantic, gnawing suspicion. The fire had been a mask, a shroud drawn over a far more deliberate act. Every ember that cooled felt like a piece of evidence that had been systematically hidden. The search for the truth shifted from a recovery mission to a desperate hunt for those who had turned the family's nightmare into a calculated, unexplained disappearance. Decades bled into one another, turning the sharp agony of loss into a dull, permanent ache. Jenny had long since stopped expecting the mail to bring anything but bills or circulars. Then came the envelope in 1967. It bore no return address and felt unnaturally thick against her palm. She retreated to the kitchen table, her fingers trembling as she tore the paper edge. Inside lay a single, glossy photograph. It was a young man, face turned slightly toward the lens, his eyes and jawline mirrors of the son she had lost 22 years ago. She stopped breathing. She turned the photo over. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, and unmistakably personal. It read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother." The ink looked fresh, almost wet against the cardstock. Jenny pressed the image to her chest, the sudden surge of hope hitting her with the force of a physical blow. George leaned in, his heavy hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. They stared at the face in the photograph, searching for any sign of a trick, yet finding only the haunting, undeniable likeness of their child. The silence of the house, once a tomb, now felt like a waiting room. The nightmare was not over. It had simply found a new, terrifying voice. The photograph was not a conclusion. It was a catalyst. George and Jenny could no longer contain their search within the walls of their home. They needed the world to see what had been taken. They commissioned a massive billboard, a towering structure of wood and paint, and planted it firmly alongside the highway. It displayed the 5 faces, frozen in the youth they had possessed on that final Christmas Eve. Every day, thousands of commuters sped past, their eyes catching the haunting gaze of the missing children. The wind battered the sign, rain streaked the paint, but the Sodders remained vigilant. They returned to the site repeatedly, hammering loose boards, refreshing the faces, and ensuring no one could drive by without confronting the impossible void. It became a landmark of grief, a silent scream projected onto the horizon. They did not care about the stares of strangers or the whispers of those who wanted them to move on. The billboard was their defiance. It stood as a physical anchor in a world that had tried to erase their children from existence. As years turned into decades, the paint faded under the sun, yet the faces remained sharp, a relentless visual accusation that refused to let the truth be buried by time. Time eventually eroded the billboard, but the soil held on to its secrets with stubborn persistence. In 2011, decades after the embers had gone cold, investigators returned to the site of the original home. They sifted through the dirt, looking for any trace of the past. Their trowels scraped against something hard, buried deep in the earth. It was a small, fragmented piece of human vertebra. The discovery sent a jolt through the community, a final, desperate chance to close the book on the tragedy. They rushed the fragment to the laboratory, subjecting it to the most advanced DNA testing available. The parents were long gone, but the surviving relatives waited for a definitive word. The results came back as a hollow silence. The analysis provided no closure, no link to the children, and no explanation for how the bone reached that depth. The site remained a graveyard of questions rather than answers. The modern technology that was supposed to solve the riddle only deepened the void. History had its proof of a catastrophe, yet it offered no path to the truth. The ache remained, sharp and unyielding, a testament to a mystery that refused to be deciphered by the tools of the present. The search for answers has reached its quiet end. There are no more leads to follow, no more soil to sift, and no more voices to call out into the dark. 5 children went to sleep on that Christmas Eve with dreams of toys and the simple warmth of a family home, only to be erased from the world before the sun could rise. They did not leave behind a path to follow, nor did they leave a trail of evidence for history to reclaim. It did not turn to ash, and it did not crumble under the weight of the heat. It simply disappeared. It vanished into the smoke, leaving behind a void that no amount of time or technology can fill. The story of the Sodder family remains a hollow ache in the heart of history, a permanent mark on the landscape of the unknown. They remain lost in the silence of that winter night, forever suspended in the space between what was known and what will never be understood. The fire ended, but the mystery never truly stopped burning.